Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squad for boxing news and views from around the internet. The World Boxing Super Series is looking to potentially run a tournament at heavyweight as part of its Season 3. And that season, if it were to go ahead, would likely start in February 2020, the Wbss looking to run things over a calendar year instead of over the course of 2 different calendar years. So we're talking potentially quarterfinals, semis and final in roughly a 10-month period, starting in February 2020, wrapping up by the end of 2020, November or December. And promoter Kalle Sauerland, who promotes the World Boxing Super Series, he says they've got about 12 or 13 names that they're thinking of. They would need to get them down to 8, and they could even have a couple of eliminators to reach those 8 names. So the question is, who would be part of the tournament? Who would stand to gain from being in the tournament, and who's likely not to be there? And it is one of those things, I think it's easy to rule out quite a few names right off the bat, but we'll get to that. But from the perspective of the Wbss end, I think they would want to have fighters from different parts of the world. So obviously you have some broad appeal, but also you can host events there. So I think there would be at least one US fighter. There'd be probably a couple from the UK at least, and some from Europe. And those venues, US, UK and Europe, that's where they've predominantly held shows for the first couple of seasons for the different weights that they've had, so they would likely mirror that pattern that they've sort of held to date. And the money on offer, it would certainly be better than many heavyweights can earn on their own right now. So it will attract some good names, but unlikely to attract the very elite who are, either headlining their own pay-per-view events or just earning more than the Wbss could provide just on its own. Or they won't want to be tied down to, a year-long commitment, because they would have no say over the matchmaking. Effectively, they'd be tied into it. They would fight whoever was put in front of them. So I think you can rule out, champions and some of the elite guys right off the bat. So for me, Wilder, Fury, Joshua, they're all non-starters, unlikely to enter the tournament. And while we're talking about other non-starters, anyone who's a mandatory challenger and expecting a title shot in 2020, so a la Kubrat Pulev in the IBF and Alexander Usyk through the WBO, we won't be seeing them signing up to a year-long commitment. And also unlikely to sign up are veteran contenders like Alexander Povetkin and Luis Ortiz, both of whom are 40. They may not be in the sport in 6 to 12 months' time, and sort of putting potentially 2 or 3 fights in front of them. I just don't see it happening. I don't see them signing up. And actually, Sauerland, he also referenced Dillian Whyte and Daniel Dubois in his comments as possible names. But for me, I think they're both unlikely. Whyte's promoter Eddie Hearn, he's pretty adamant that Whyte's name will be cleared from recent issues, and if that is the case, I would just expect Dillian Whyte to continue doing what Dillian Whyte has been doing. He's his own pay-per-view business at the moment. I would expect him to pick that up in 2020, and that's going to earn him more than the Wbss can pay him. But also, he will be selecting his opponents in terms of his team, the matchups, all that sort of stuff. So I think for Whyte, he would be earning more and to have more say over his opponents. There's just more for him to stay out of it if in fact he clears this current situation he finds himself in. And Daniel Dubois will also lump in F.A. Jagba too. They're 2 of the most touted prospects in the division right now. They're being built in a very deliberate way for them to gain experience, become more seasoned fighters. I don't see their promoters tying them down into a tournament format where they get no say over the matchmaking. I can't see it happening. And while we're at it, I think it's unlikely that PBC will send many, if any, fighters into such a tournament, primarily because broadcasting reasons, and they need to fill out their cards to satisfy their broadcasters. I'm not sure that Fox or Showtime is going to be picking out the broadcasting rights for the World Boxing Super Series. So it's unlikely that I think PBC will send out its fighters to fight on potentially other networks. More likely that DAZN or even ESPN picks up the rights to the tournament. In the United States, that is. But also someone like Adam Kovnatsky. He's close to securing a title shot, and the PBC is going to want him ready for when that time comes. They will just keep him warm, ready, and waiting. Or if in the case of, say, Andy Ruiz Jr. loses to Anthony Joshua in the rematch, Ruiz will need to sort of pick up a decent fight in 2020. And I think a Ruiz Jr. and also Kovnatski fight, that would make a lot of sense for mid-2020. And it's possible, I think, we could see other in-house matchups between the likes of, say, Charles Martin and Gerald Washington instead of them entering the WBSS tournament. So when you start ruling out a whole host of fighters, as I've done, and I think it's more likely than not most of those guys, if not all, won't be part of the tournament, it does leave you with a much clearer picture of who could be in play and also why. And the why is effectively the names I'm about to mention is that they're not going to be directly in contention for a title in 2020. And the WBSS offers them a chance to, one, enhance their profile, they get paid well, and for some it will be career high paydays. And I think there will be a number of names that will sort of lead the list of what the WBSS would want to be in the tournament, for credibility purposes, but also they know that these guys will be in good fights. And I think a couple of the obvious ones, Kalle Sauerland, he co-promotes with Matchroom Filip Hrgović. I think this sort of tournament for Filip Hrgović would be sort of perfect. He is considered a prospect at the moment, but he's been fighting, compared to the vast majority of prospects, much higher opposition. He's much further along. He had a very sort of storied amateur career, Olympic bronze medalist from Rio. They're looking to move him along with some haste. And this sort of tournament could be a breakout event for someone like a Filip Hrgović to actually show his wares. And I think in terms of it, if he entered the tournament, he'd be one of the favourites to win it. Another guy who's in a similar sort of situation is Joe Joyce. I think someone like Joyce at now, 33 or 34 years old? He's just had a birthday. I can't remember. It might be 34. Joyce is looking to move along, get into some contender level fights and really start making a name for himself, work towards a title shot. I can't see a title shot with one of the main sanctioning bodies coming up in the next year, but something like this could be occupy Joyce's time and be very good for his career, his profile, and move him to the direction that he wants to go. And the fact that Joyce also has a version of a heavyweight belt, the WBA gold title, I think that would be attractive for the WBSS organisers as well, because simply put, having some hardware there which they could promote would be good. It'd be one of the few belts that I think they could actually put up on the line. Another guy who I think would be a shoo-in, similar to Joyce and similar to Hrgović, looking for bigger and better fights, would be Michael Hunter. He's on the cusp of really having a couple of big fights within the heavyweight division, and something like this could increase his profile, tenfold. I think it would be very good for Hunter, Joyce, Hrgović. They are sort of in that position where they're on the way up. They haven't been to the top yet, but this tournament could put them a lot closer. They are three of my very obvious choices that I think would almost be shoo-ins. The sort of fourth one, who's been to the mountaintop before, who's been a former champion, is Joseph Parker. I think they're going to want to keep him active with meaningful fights in 2020, and I think the WBSS could provide some good paydays, and Joseph Parker would be a name to target for the tournament. And I think win or lose against Derek Chisora, I think the WBSS in terms of the next year, because he's not in direct contention for a title right now, I think it would make a lot of sense for Joseph Parker, but also for Derek Chisora. And as we know, Derek Chisora likes to chase the money too, and if he lost against Joseph Parker, I think this could be a very viable option for Derek Chisora. He's a name, he's obviously a former title challenger, he's had some wins and losses, but he would give anyone that he was up against in the World Boxing Super Series at heavyweight tournament a very good fight, and I think some people would fancy him to sort of advance to the later stages of the tournament. Similarly with Joseph Parker, there would be a lot of pride and prestige on the line for anyone that enters this event. So there's 4 or 5 names that I think, would be obvious choices. But then it comes down to a number of other names that you can kind of sort of splice in and out in terms of would they want to be part of the tournament. But also it starts to become, because a lot of the names I'm about to name are either with ESPN or Matchroom. And with the World Boxing Super Series, we're seeing that they have partnered with Matchroom for the final of the 140-pound division between Taylor and Prograis. So it may be a case where some of these events, if they end up having, say, 4 Matchroom fighters within the 8 or something like that, then they may look to have that sort of joint effort in terms of putting on the shows in the UK or wherever with Matchroom. They may end up looking to partner again, especially for a tournament at heavyweight. Matchroom's got a whole stack of fighters, and we do need to see some of these guys start fighting off against each other. But in the sort of tournament format, I think for a lot of these guys, there's a lot to sort of gain here. And there's a few other guys on the fringes as well, in terms of they're not locked up with one of the main promoters, for example, like David Price, for example. He's looked after by MTK. He doesn't fight under the Matchroom banner, but he has fought on Matchroom cards. Carlos Takam is another sort of example. He's just been with Star Boxing. He's just signed on with Star Boxing, should I say. But in terms of his prospects in the heavyweight division, Carlos Takam entering the tournament, David Price entering the tournament. They do have some pedigree. They're veteran contenders. Price coming off a good win, but also he's got a bit of a following too. So David Price, he more sort of fits, I think, in that he's a name category. Would he be able to win the tournament? I don't think many people would back him to, but he would be a good name to line up potentially. And there will be some guys that, if they're talking about having some eliminators to get into the tournament, that could be its own card ahead of the tournament starting. So in terms of, I'll just run through, I've got 12 other names in addition to, I think, the 5 that I've already mentioned. So effectively, you could have guys like Hughie Fury. They've talked about him having a tune-up fight towards the end of 2019 and then stepping up again. So stepping into the tournament after the back of that tune-up, we get into some fights where he could maybe rehabilitate his image. That could be the way to go. And it wouldn't be taking a just massive step up back to a world-level top 10 necessarily, because I think, as I've outlined, most of the guys that are sort of named are not within the top 10. So this could be a lot of sort of top 10 to top 25 type fights. And at the moment, that might be what a Hughie Fury would need. Bryant Jennings, he is another name. I sort of see him at a little bit of a loose end. He obviously had a good fight with Joe Joyce. He came up short in that one, but he is a former world title challenger. I think he would be add something to the tournament. Another guy, Oscar Rivas. He seemingly might be at a loose end after this loss to Dillian White. We'll have to see what happens there, but I think he could be in the tournament and be someone who could actually generate a bit of hype and buzz. Having guys like, say, Parker, Joyce, Hunter, Hrgovic, Oscar Rivas, Bryant Jennings, it's got the makings of a very good tournament. Then you have some other guys like Ajit Kabayal, for example. Martin Bakole. I think Bakole would go in as a bit of a dark horse, because obviously if he can sort of tighten up on some of the things that he does from after that Hunter fight, and he has been doing so, he could end up knocking a few guys out in the tournament. Someone from Frank Warren's stable, apart from Joe Joyce, I think, is Nathan Gorman. This could be a good next step for a Nathan Gorman, because where does he go from here? And if he wants to earn some good money and sort of try to get towards the deep end of the tournament, I think this could be a perfect opportunity for him. Another name, we've just seen him fighting against Tyson Fury, Otto Warren. That could end up working out quite well for Otto Warren. He could add something to the tournament with his newfound sort of profile, and I think he could be in a couple of good fights. Other names that you could sort of look at, I've sort of mentioned Chisora, I've mentioned Takam, Robert Helenius. He's not tethered to anyone at the moment. He could potentially be a name that could go in there. I think that would be a credible name to have in the tournament. Someone else who's coming off a bit of a stinker, but could be a name as well to enter the tournament, Sergey Kuzmin. After his loss to Michael Hunter, I mean, where does he go? I mean, maybe he would sort of fit into that category. Perhaps you could have some qualifiers to enter the tournament. You could have guys like Nathan Gorman and Sergey Kuzmin in a qualifier, and maybe David Price and Robert Helenius, or, there's a few of these guys, maybe Martin Bakole in a qualifier. Maybe you would have the top sort of 4 or 5 or 6 guys already worked out and have the last couple of places up for grabs. And I've got another couple of guys that have got question marks about who could be in the tournament, could bring hardware to the table. Mahmoud Shah, the WBA regular title, and Trevor Bryan. They were meant to be fighting each other. Who knows where that's at? But I do think that they could add something to it. Trevor Bryan being another American name, decent paydays. He's obviously been out of the ring for over a year now. If he's not going to be fighting Mahmoud Shah, or Shah is also at a loose end as well, why not enter the tournament? So I've got a question mark over those guys, but I think the other guys that have named, so you've got Fury, Cabial, Price, Gorman, Kuzman, Takam, Chisora, Helenius, Wanan, Bacoli, Rivas, Jennings, they could be part of a tournament. And I think the guys who would basically be a shoe-in, I think, would be Joe Joyce, Michael Hunter, Philip Hergovich, and Joseph Parker. Maybe you could have those as top 4 seeds, and maybe Chisora somewhere in there as well. I don't know. What do you make of it all? And I do think that my rationale for excluding some of these fighters, I don't think it's unreasonable or unfair. And I think we've got down to, from what I've got, about 15 or 16 names. Some of it may come down to injury and availability, but I think the core of the 8 guys who would be in the tournament, plus if there was any qualifiers, come in that group. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.